The year is 1914. The First World War has just begun. In France, a wounded German soldier is struggling to get away from the British forces, slowly closing in. Suddenly, the Germans spot a British soldier in the distance. He's too wounded to even lift his own weapon and awaits his inevitable doom. But the British soldier lowers his rifle and chooses not to shoot the wounded man. The German just nods before wandering off. The British soldier, Henry Tanday, wouldn't find out that the person he didn't shoot that day was 29-year-old Lance Corporal Adolf Hitler. The story is supposedly true. I say supposedly because the story is very heavily disputed. What we do know is that Hitler made several remarks about the event, such as, "That man came so near to killing me that I thought I should never see Germany again," when asked about a painting with Henry Tanday in it. If we take a quick look at what Europe looked like in 1941 in the middle of World War II, there are two countries that sort of sticks out. Both Sweden and Switzerland are still neutral even though they're seemingly right in the middle of the war. Alright, so Switzerland, they could keep their neutrality for two primary reasons: their banks and the country's location. Switzerland has long been known for their secure banking, and during World War II, a lot of countries used Swiss banks to store their money. And if the country was kept neutral, their wealth would be untouched despite the outcome of the war. The second reason is the location, because Germany already had control over every country surrounding Switzerland. Hitler didn't see the country as much of a priority because if they won the war, Switzerland would be taken over either way. However, an invasion was actually planned called Operation Tannenbaum, but it was never carried out, most likely for the aforementioned reasons. Okay, so what about Sweden then? Well, Sweden on the other hand has long maintained diplomatic neutrality since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. But more than that, Sweden helped Finland fight against the Soviet Union by providing volunteers as well as food and materials. So in reality, Sweden was actually helping Germany by helping Finland, and in the eyes of the Germans, they were not necessarily allies, but were certainly not enemies. Shiba Inu is one of the oldest dog breeds in the world, dating back to 3rd century BC. But during World War II, the breed almost went completely extinct. This was due to a combination of soldiers killing them to use their fur to make coats, an ever-growing food shortage, as well as a distemper pandemic. In fact, all subsequent dogs were bred from the only 3 surviving bloodlines. World War III almost happened right after World War II ended in 1945. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was concerned that with the enormous size of Soviet forces deployed in Europe at the end of the war and the perception that Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was unreliable, there was a serious threat to Western Europe. So the British developed Operation Unthinkable, also known as the Third World War Plan. However, the plan was rejected because the manpower needed to fight the large amount of remaining Soviet forces was deemed to not be enough. On December 17, 1944, the Japanese army sent 23-year-old soldier Hiro Onoda to the Philippines to fight for his country. Not long after he and his squad arrived, the Allied forces attacked. He and 3 of his men had no other choice but to retreat into the jungle. A few months later, the war ended. But when they found papers saying that the war had in fact ended, they thought it was just a propaganda trick to get them out of hiding. It would be almost 30 years until Hiro came out of the jungle and finally realizing that the war was actually over. During that time, one of his soldiers left and the other 2 had died of injuries. In 1974, Hiro returned to civilization for the first time since his deployment in 1944. He was now 53 years old. But he managed to live a normal life after that and died on January 16, 2014. Amazingly, he was not the only one. A man in 1972 and another man in 1974 was also found to be surviving in similar conditions, believing World War II was still going on. There was a plan proposed in 1962 named Operation Northwoods that called for the CIA to commit genuine acts of terrorism inside the United States. This was so they could blame the attacks on the Cuban government and thus creating public support to start a war against and eventually overthrow Cuba, which had recently become communist. The operation was suggested and signed by GCS as well as the DoD, but fortunately President John F. Kennedy rejected it. According to currently released documentation, none of the operations proposed were ever acted out. It's scary to think that while this operation, which is known to the public, was rejected, you can't help but wonder what else might get approved. The shortest officially recognized war took place in 1896 when Zanzibar surrendered to Britain after only 40 minutes. The longest recorded war was the so-called 100 Years' War between Britain and France. It actually lasted 116 years, ending in 1453. World War II is the deadliest conflict in human history. Between 60 to 80 million people died from 1939 to 1945, which was more than 2.5% of the whole world's population. Maybe one of the most horrifying results of World War II is that over 60% of the people who died were civilians. At least 6 million of them were murdered in concentration camps during the Holocaust. But one thing you probably don't hear about often is that the Japanese actually killed more people than the Nazi regime. And just like the Germans, they performed very disturbing human experiments, tortured and cannibalized prisoners of war, and forced hundreds of thousands of women into military sex slavery. But on a happier note, when word arrived in Moscow in 1945 that the Germans had surrendered, people took to the streets and just started a big-ass party. And shit got out of control. Tens of thousands of people celebrated for hours and literally transformed one of the largest cities on the planet into a sea of vodka. In fact, after over 30 hours of constant celebration, there were simply no more vodka to be found anywhere. This was not the day the war ended, this was the day Moscow ran out of vodka. If World War III ever happens, it will most likely involve nuclear weapons, which will most likely wipe out most of humanity. I know, fun things to think about, right? But we've actually been close to nuclear war several times over since the World War II ended. In 1980, NORAD's computer suddenly showed 2 incoming missiles. Shortly after, it showed 220 incoming missiles. The Air Force began sending out bombers carrying nukes, and America basically went all ballistic fucking apeshit for a few hours. But luckily, before anyone started dropping nukes for nothing, it was found that a tiny chip had malfunctioned. A similar event took place in the 1950s when the Strategic Air Command could not contact any radars that were designed to warn about an incoming attack. Eventually though, everyone got their shit together and realized that the radar connections went through a single telephone line which had overheated a relay station. In 1971, a guy inserted the wrong tape to test the emergency broadcast system, so instead the actual warning for nuclear attack was played. I bet that was a fun morning. In 1979, an Air Force officer booted up a simulation program that would simulate what would happen if the Soviet Union fired 1,000 nuclear missiles at the same time. Unfortunately, his computer was linked to NORAD's mainframe, which made it look like the simulation was actually real. Let's just say that the people over at NORAD went all bananas up a refrigerated anal. Okay, you know what? This has happened so many times, there's no point in even listing them all. I guess today you've learned that when the Americans say there's an incoming nuclear attack, they're just fucking with you.